Hello and welcome to Europe Talks. My name is Hannah Israel. I'm a journalist and project lead of My Country Talks, the international platform for political debate.
And my name is Sebastian Horn. I'm Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Zeit Online and one of the co-founders of My Country Talks.
Today, thousands of Europeans are going to have a political discussion with someone they totally disagree with someone they have never met, a complete stranger. They will meet online, one-on-one, and discuss the most important issues facing all Europeans today, which is of course the corona pandemic, but they will also talk about migration and climate change. Before those discussions are going to take place today at 3 p.m, Sebastian and I will guide you through a program of lightning talks, panels, and performances. Some of you might still wonder what Europe Talks is actually all about and how it came into existence. And for that, this film might help.
When was the last time you talked to a stranger who totally disagreed with you? In spring 2019, more than 16,000 Europeans from 33 countries signed up to have a political argument with a stranger. They were all part of the project Europe Talks. So this is how Ellie and Morris met.
We're going to talk with each other, so I'm going to have a little bit of conversations today with Morris.
That's the idea. Yeah, we'll see how it turns out.
It is scientifically proven that whenever two people meet for at least 2 hours, face to face, to have a discussion, they change. They change their perspective, little by little, discussion by discussion.
High five.
Yeah. So we found something that we agree on a topic that we disagreed.
Yes, the conflict is much less pronounced.
I can understand Maria, even when I disagree with her.
In recent years, also we as journalists were impressed by political developments like Brexit or Donald Trump or the German immigration debate.
Open political discussions became more and more difficult in the last years. We humans like to stay in our filter bubbles. We don't want to be challenged in our beliefs.
You don't learn to evolve, you don't see the faults in your own ideas anymore if you only listen to those that agree with you.
So we as journalists asked ourselves, how can we bring people of different political opinions into a dialogue with each other? So what we thought about is a Tinder for politics, a dating platform for political opposites.
We started it in 2017 in Germany and called it Deutschland spricht, Germany talks. We simply ask our readers 5 yes or no questions about topics like same-sex marriage, immigration or nuclear power. Then we match people who disagreed the most and asked them to have a conversation.
We expected just a few hundred people maximum to sign up.
By the end, 12,000 Germans had signed up to participate. We had a bit of a problem because how are we going to match all these participants?
That's why we built a unique algorithm with our developers. Now we were able to automatically match all these participants and allow them to meet up.
But we had many concerns. What if nobody shows up? Or if we have an ex-murderer in our database? But then something beautiful happened. Thousands of Germans met in pairs and talked about politics peacefully.
We were really excited and wanted to increase the diversity of people and include other nations to create a cross-border dialogue.
So in 2019, we launched Europe Talks with 15 international media partners from all across Europe. And again, people met to have a peaceful discussion.
And today, in 2020, all of Europe is meeting up again. Over 12,000 people have signed up to have a conversation. Our algorithm matched pairs with totally different views on climate change, migration, and, of course, how to deal with the coronavirus.
The corona pandemic has affected me in so many ways.
My routine changed completely with corona.
First off, my job. You know, I haven't worked now since the 6th of March.
Everything's in the living room. I socialize here, I work here, I meet my supervisors here. Everything online.
You know, Christmas and, you know, bills that are adding up and how am I going to get back on top of them?
I signed up for Europe Talks because I wanted to connect with other humans in Europe and actually share ideas with people who think in a different manner that I do.
I can now talk to Be it, you know, somebody in Poland, be it somebody in Germany or wherever.
What that creates is conversations, real conversations.
Something that this pandemic has removed is that connection we could have and that sense of debate.
If we just learn a little bit more about each other and understand more where everybody's coming from, I think we can be more connected with each other and kinder to each other as well. And yeah, I really just want to connect with someone and learn more about where they are right now.
You know, people are feeling the same hurt, the same pain, the same fears, and it's just good to know you're not alone.
We would have loved to be here today on a big stage with all of our media partners from across the continent. But since this pandemic won't let us, we have instead asked them to record a little video, say hi, and let them explain in their own words why they joined Europe Talks.
Hi from Switzerland, this is Republic.
After this very crazy year, it is more important than ever to reach out across geographical and ideological boundaries. So we think it's a really cool project and we're in this all together.
Hi, I'm a journalist covering European affairs for France 24, the French international TV news channel. This year, for the first time, France 24 is taking part in Europe Talks. Why is that? Because as journalists, we think it is vital to get people out of their bubbles and give them a space where they can meet people with different ideas. In short, we want to keep debate alive in Europe. And in 2020, with all the social and travel restrictions, we think that helping build those bridges is even more important.
BTV News is pleased that Bulgaria is taking part in Europe Talks 2020.
In this very special year, it is crucial for all of us to stay in touch, exchange ideas and talk about the topics that excite us.
Debates help us finding truth, and we as journalists are always in quest of it.
We are delighted by the fact that Europe Talks 2020 will make the Bulgarian perspective known to the rest of our diverse European family.
Espresso is joining Europe Talks for the first time this year, so that we can all know each other better. We believe that giving our readers the chance to have unfiltered conversations with citizens from other countries about important matters of today is a way of building a continent that is more prone to dialogue, with an input from Portugal.
Dear Europe Talks friends, I'm Robert Lupitzu and I'm the editor-in-chief of Calea Europeană.ro, the main EU and transatlantic affairs media platform in Romania. And it was our distinguished pleasure to be a part of this outstanding and very important project. Let's talk about Europe, not just in a beautiful project like this, but also every day. Let's talk about Europe and our common values. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Georgia Sakoula. I'm a reporter for the Efemerida to Stakton from Greece. We're very happy to be part of Europe Talks for another year.
Hey everybody, we're the Volkskrant from the Netherlands. We are participating because we believe in the power of communication and we hope you will have better luck in finding common ground than Boris and Ursula did.
Hello from Rome, I'm Beniamino Pagliaro. I'm one of the editors at La Repubblica. Here we are in the main newsroom in Rome. I really think that being able to talk with each other is crucial to the quality of our democracy. So journalists should work with this goal in mind to provide news and context. Europe Talks is a great opportunity for us and our readers. Thank you.
We are very happy that Europe Talks can take place today online. And this would have not been possible without all the great help and effort from our supporters, which we would really like to thank now. Europe Talks is supported by the German Foreign Office on the occasion of the German EU Presidency 2020, as well as by the European Cultural Foundation, the Allianz Kulturstiftung, as well as the Evans Foundation. Europe Talks is also partnering with the Goethe Institute.
But today is actually all about the participants of Europe Talks. 12,000 people from 34 countries have signed up over the last couple of weeks to meet another European today. They all answered 7 yes or no questions when they registered, and you can see them here. Should richer European countries help poorer ones in the fight against corona? Should all European countries have to accept refugees? Should masks be mandatory in all public spaces? Should protecting people from the coronavirus be the first priority, even if the economy suffers? Should schools always remain open throughout the pandemic? Is Russia a threat to Europe? And should all European cities be car-free? On average, the discussion pairs today disagree on 5 out of these 7 questions. So we should have some really interesting conversations taking place all across Europe today. To get everyone ready for their conversation, we have put together a 2-hour program for you. And to kick things off, we would now like to welcome Dubravka Šuica from Croatia, Vice President of the EU Commission for Democracy and Demography. She will talk to my colleague and My Country Talks co-founder, Maria Exner. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today and I'm delighted to see all of you. I am Maria Exner. I'm editor-in-chief of Zeit magazine and one of the co-founders of My Country Talks and Europe Talks. And I reached out very warmly to Dubravka Šuica. She is the Vice President for Democracy and Demography of the EU Commission. And she looks back on a long career in European politics. She was the mayor of Dubrovnik in her home state of Croatia from 2001 till 2009, and has represented the group of the European People's Parties as a member of the European Parliament for many years. And since 2019, she holds the position of Vice President of the EU Commission. It's great to see you. And maybe from where are you tuning in today?
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. I'm tuning in from Brussels, from my home, because it's Sunday.
Dear Vice President, maybe just to give our viewers a short idea, this position that you hold of Commissioner for Democracy and Demography is a new role. And maybe you can give our viewers a short impression of what this entails. What is your scope of work?
First of all, thank you for having me here today. I'm honored. You know that my work is all about people's lives, from childhood to adulthood and old age. So the power of dialogue becomes clear. From day one, as Vice President of the European Commission in charge for democracy and demography, I have invested all my energy in citizens' engagement and empowerment because I truly believe in this. This is part of why I'm here today with you. So the reality is that some people feel left behind and they are blaming democracy. But does it mean that we should get rid of democracy? Of course not. But they start blaming democracy. But it's in fact demographic change to be blamed, but our politics has changed. Our societies are changing all the time, so we must adapt. And we cannot address new problems with old ways of looking at the world. So we need a democracy that is fit for the future, one that is sustainable and which responds to citizens. So one of the tools we are using to make our democracy more responsive, more resilient, is the Conference on the Future of Europe. It is an exercise in deliberative democracy where we engage with people of all ages, backgrounds, and location across all European Union. A bit like what we are doing here today. So it's on democracy and demography. It's longer, so I don't want to burden you now, but maybe next time about demography.
Maybe just because you were mentioning that people feel left behind during the pandemic in all of Europe. And I think we have put also a strong focus in the media on the elderly people. But you recently have said very strongly that the children of Europe have been looked over during the pandemic. And one of the questions in Europe Talks was, should schools stay open throughout the pandemic at all costs? And the majority of the Europeans that participate have said yes. And so maybe you can, in short, say something about what the EU Commission has learned from how the children have been left behind and what they can do to, make them more safe in the future in their education.
Yes, very good question. The corona pandemic has deeply affected all of our citizens, but especially the most vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, I think about the very young and the very old. So the pandemic has shown inequalities in access to education. Not every child has parents who can help him or her with homework. Not every parent can afford access to technological equipment or the internet. For some children, schools are more than lessons and homework. So I'm really happy that you asked these questions, which I couldn't see the answers, but I will try to see them. So schools may offer the only meal of the day sometimes and can be a refuge from domestic violence. As a grandmother myself, it saddens me greatly to see how child abuse has risen during this pandemic. I wish it was not necessary, but we need to talk about this more. It is an issue that is underreported. Putting the right policies in place means we need to reach out to children and young people to understand their experiences during pandemic. And since we are not fully able at this moment to foresee the long-term impact of this crisis, we need to ensure that in our recovery plans, we ensure that they are to take them into account. So together with my colleagues in Commission, I'm working on a strong child rights dimension, as you know. And of course, we must support children's health issues through psychological support and social and everything. So this is also a part of the digital education plan, which includes children digital skills. And we are just about to adopt it next Tuesday.
Okay. So we hope that during the next crisis, our children will have full education, even though they are remote or only digitally. Another quote that you were just mentioning that I saw in a recent debate in the EU Commission from you was that people feel left behind during this year and they blame it on democracy. And I would like you to say a few words about in what way, the coronavirus crisis is not only a public health crisis, but also a crisis of democracy. Like, in what way do you think that, weaknesses of our democracies have been really revealed in this year?
So, as I already said, that democracy shouldn't be blamed because there is nothing better than democracy. But people, since they feel left behind, they start not taking part in democratic processes and they start not believing in democratic institutions. So we have to reinforce the bedrock of our democracy. And part of the answer to this is making sure that our citizens are engaged, better informed, and that they have access to genuine and truthful exchanges like this one. This is also part of making our democracy fit for the future. This is what I'm insisting on. So we need also a cultural shift. We need to educate. We need to provide public sphere where people of all ages, including children, can express their views. And I think only like this. And of course, why don't you, maybe you invited children today, why don't you invite children to participate in these events?
It's a good idea for the future. Thank you.
Yes, I would welcome the opportunity to share this platform with the child because they are already making their voices heard in our policy making and in the Commission, and we will take them into account in the conference on the future of Europe. There will be not only youth panel, but panel for children. So we think that through these exchanges like this today, we learn more about each other and we are less likely to accept disinformation and malpropaganda, if I may say so. So Conference of the Future Europe will be another platform through which discussions will be held, and it will be opportunity for citizens of all backgrounds and opinions across European Union to engage with each other, even those who are anti-European, who are Eurosceptics. We want to reach out to them and to see what are the reasons which lie background, what is the background for their behavior. So we have to, this is the reason why we are organizing this 2 years long exercise, which is called Conference on the Future of Europe. And we think that we can make democracy stronger and more resilient.
And what do you think if our participants now maybe have heard about the idea of the Conference of the Future of Europe for the first time? It's a project that Ursula von der Leyen has promoted very strongly in her entrance as a EU Commission President. When do you think will citizens have the opportunity to take part in concrete discussions with the Conference of the Future of Europe? Just to give us a short timeline idea in the last few seconds that we have.
President von der Leyen is very keen about this Conference of the Future of Europe, and it should have started during Croatian presidency on Day of Europe on 9th of May, but you know, since these circumstances didn't allow us, so we are looking forward to start in January during the Portuguese presidency, and now we are definite that we have to start it online. So Commission prepared multilingual digital platform on which everyone would be able to participate, but according to the rules and so on. So I was preaching about this conference whole year. So I'm looking forward to have you on board. So you are more than welcome to be on board. Sorry, I see that we don't have enough time for this elaboration.
But thank you so much for shining a light on this important, I think, dialogue and for being here with us today. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much for being here, Vice President. And back over to Sebastian and Hannah in the studio.
Thank you, Maria, for inviting me. All of you. All the best.
Thank you very much, Maria. We will now hear 4 very inspiring lightning talks, and those come from a wide range of different disciplines and backgrounds. In the spirit of Europe Talks, our aim was to really include as many different perspectives as possible, both in terms of views on the pandemic as well as Europe as a whole. And we will now hear some welcoming words from Michael Roth, who is the Minister of State for Europe at Germany's Federal Foreign Office.
It has never been so important for us to be alone, together, in order to protect each other. These words were on the cover of Zeit magazine in March, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in December, I would like to add, it has never been so important to talk to each other, to keep in touch, and to be present. We should keep physical distance, not social distance. But rarely have these basic principles of communication been as difficult to put into practice as they are now. COVID-19 has changed our everyday life. On a personal level, it has changed how we approach one another, how we confide in one another, and how we talk to one another. But this is also a chance for all of us. For instance, at the informal meeting of European ministers on the 1st of December, I invited young people from all over Europe to discuss their hopes and ideas for Europe's future. Talking to one another about common issues and concerns is part of an active European public sphere. Strengthening and promoting this European public sphere is a core aim of our presidency of the Council. Projects such as Olafur Eliasson's Earth Speaker can have an impact on our ability to achieve this aim. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you to Europe Talks. We at the Federal Foreign Office are delighted that this event has been adopted to take place online and can go ahead despite all the uncertainties of 2020. I would like to congratulate the team at Zeit Online and all of your partners. Europe Talks proves how important it is to leave your filter bubble and comfort zone. It's also an excellent example of what we can expect from the proposed conference on the future of Europe, which is very close to my heart and aims to bring people together to exchange their views, ideas, and concerns about Europe. After all, conversations like these help us to realize that despite of all our differences, there is more that unites us than divides us. With this in mind, dear viewers, dear participants, dear organizers, have fun with Europe Talks. Speak your mind, listen, and take care of each other. I hope you enjoy exciting and inspiring discussions. One thing has become clear this year. We are in this together. Stay healthy.
Thank you, Michael Roth, for sending over this wonderful video. Our second lightning talk today is by Francesca Melandri, the award-winning novelist, screenwriter, and documentary filmmaker from Italy. She will talk about a question that we're all facing in this pandemic. Do we give into fear or work together to get out of this crisis?
When I was asked by the Zeit to hold this short talk, of course, I started thinking about which of the many topics, which the people which will be asked to debate from different viewpoints, I could focus on. But then I thought, I'm not a politician, I'm not an economist, I'm not a healthcare expert, I'm a writer. And the stuff of my job as a writer is the human experience, both on the individual level and on the collective level. So I would like to focus about emotions, about feelings. The feelings that have been felt both individually and collectively in these long pandemic months. We're now in the midst of a second wave. People are again sick, people are again dying, economies are again struggling, and there is a lot of suffering and unease. And even if the vaccines are, it seems as if they're coming like the cavalry, but anyway, it's very probable that the winter ahead is going to be a tough one. So there is a lot of emotions, and these emotions are sweeping us away. There's a sense of dread, fatigue, loss, sadness, grief, fear, anxiety, worry. We're bewildered, and there's a sense of a lack of perspective. A sense of being prisoners, restricted in our own homes, in our own tiny lives. We're already now seeing how almost every issue nowadays divides the public in almost two fields, apparently unreconcilable. And it's more and more often that people who hold different opinions don't view the people who hold different opinions as people who hold different opinions, but as enemies, enemies to be hated. And it's very easy to see how this can be manipulated by people whose idea of society is not democratic and open debate, but a society which ultimately has the goal of physically destroying people who dissent. Also, these authoritarians thrive on anxiety. They stimulate it, while at the same time, and this is important, they thrive on anxiety, but they do nothing to actually address the reasons, the real and very rational reasons why people are afraid. For instance, the fear of climate change. There are no practical solutions implemented. There is just a fueling up of a general anxiety. This is why I'm convinced that acknowledging these emotions and talking about them is not a sentimental act, but it's actually a very political act. To bring them, so to speak, to the light, to speak about them, to not let them rot in the loneliness and shame of people, is the only way to prevent them from being used in this way. As historian Robert Paxton observed, fascism is propelled by emotions, not by thought. This is why I think it's really fundamental to remember a basic fact of human nature. Underneath every resentment, every hate, there is fear. And underneath every fear, there is pain. The pain of loss, of poverty, of loneliness, of uncertainty, of stress, of being swept away by the feeling of being overwhelmed by phenomena like a pandemic or like climate change, which are just too big to cope with, just on a too big a scale for the small individual. And this produces a stage of bewildered helplessness. And underneath all these feelings, there is the most human of feelings of all, which is the fear of death. And this fear can, of course, be expressed directly, or most often also indirectly, in its opposite, the denial of death. Because at the end of the day, we're mortals, more and before anything else. And this is something we cannot change. But we do have a choice on how we can use this awareness, the awareness of our mortality, therefore of our fragility. We can use it as a gateway to the awareness of the fragility of others, and therefore as a fuel for more solidarity, for the fight towards more equality and justice for everyone. Or we can let authoritarians snatch it, use it and turn it into resentment, selfishness, hate. This goes both at the individual level and at the collective level. If as a person I am afraid or I don't know anymore how to pay next month's rent, I can either hate and be very resentful of everybody else who still can't pay their rent, on one hand, that's one choice, or the other choice is to unite with all people who are in need and to see that my need is not the only one and fight for having help, the needed help from the collective, from society, from the state, so that people can pay their rent and keep a roof on their head. Not just me, but others too. And the same way, European countries facing impending economic recession, social unrest, or a health crisis, they can choose to withdraw into nationalist selfishness, one against the other, or they can unite and tackle these and the further global challenges, which are certainly awaiting us, with a vision of the collective good, the collective interest, and also the global relevance of a united Europe as a whole. So how shall we use this renewed awareness of our fragility? That is our choice. That is the choice that we are facing as living biological creatures, as social human beings, as Europeans, and as inhabitants of a very beautiful, tiny, fragile planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for those very emotional words. Johnny Pitts is a British writer and author of Afropene, a book that explores the cultural, social, and aesthetic interplay of European and Black cultures. For that book, he actually just won the Leipzig Book Award for European Understanding. In his lightning talk, he's gonna recount memories of his childhood back in Sheffield, where he grew up, an industrial city where the majority of people actually voted to leave the EU. And I think he has some very interesting thoughts on how all that was possible.
I grew up in a working class area of Sheffield, a city in the north of England, which during the 80s and 90s was like a post-industrial carcass trying to redefine itself in the face of free market globalisation. Many of the major steelworks, which Sheffield was so famous for and which employed a lot of my family, were closed down and shiny new shopping malls began to sprout up everywhere. Sport and leisure, travel and tourism, retail and consumption, these things were part of a new global world order. You might detect a hint of cynicism in my voice as I'm talking about this transformation. But as a child growing up, I have to admit that I remember feeling a welcome relief when gloomy grey factories were replaced by postmodern buildings in primary colours. There was a sense of dynamism and optimism in the air. In 1997, Tony Blair was elected. He was supposedly left-wing and liberal, and Britain, for a brief moment, finally stopped dining out on its history of warfare and exploitation and was looking forward to a bold, multicultural future, closer to Europe than ever before, as a place that cooperated with the rest of the world. My group of friends consisted of a 6'3" rugby-playing white guy, a Muslim Yemeni footballer, a rock music-loving Tanzanian, and a hip-hop loving white boy who could speak perfect patois. This multiculturalism took place unofficially. It wasn't staged, but rather we were bonded together with the understanding that we had a common enemy, Margaret Thatcher, the racist Prime Minister at the time who crushed the industrial foundations of our city. However, in the end, New Labour promoted a multiculturalism that seemed designed only for those who could afford to go to university or work in finance. And beneath this, he had members of Blair's own cabinet producing anti-immigrant rhetoric, saying British schools were being swamped by asylum seekers. Fractures began to appear all over British society. The promise of the drum and bass music scene in the mid-90s, where multiculturalism took place off-grid, gave way to ghetto fabulous black bling culture on the one hand and laddish white working-class Britpop on the other. During the New Labour years, I noticed how multiculturalism was detached from working class culture and connected to globalisation. A corporate multiculturalism could be seen on billboards found in elite international spaces, the hotel lobby, the airport lounge, the global business network. The neoliberal project that was failing people co-opted multiculturalism as it was undermining it. A global elite, an underpaid poor, more immigration to fill the labour market. Working classes left to their own devices to forge goodwill with newcomers, while the right-leaning press vilified not their mates, the business owners, but the new proletariat with different accents. When the 2008 financial crisis happened, multiculturalism was the scapegoat and became a charged reminder of the failures of neoliberal capitalism and globalisation. These people were cynically demonised by the people in power. David Cameron, Angela Merkel, they went on record during this era as saying multiculturalism had failed. Vladimir Putin recently said it was no longer tenable. The people at the bottom of globalisation were trounced upon to protect those at the top. But it is in fact at the bottom where multiculturalism actually has a chance, where those subjugated can build everyday conviviality if they're not pitted against one another, which is what happened with me and my friends in the 90s. What a change to now. In my area, 81% of the people who voted in my constituency voted to leave the EU, and only 9% of the residents have been to university. There's a correlation there, but it's not just about education. It was about putting a glitch in an oblivious system geared towards the middle and upper classes, but one that was unfortunately steered by those on the right rather than those on the left. Free market globalisation may have been free, but it hasn't been fair. And until we reckon with the inherent inequities that it's produced, nationally and internationally, until those wealthy, powerful people who would call themselves liberal and left-wing look at the fractures produced by the system that has benefited them, this scary rising populism will remain.
Thank you so much, Johnny Pitts, for sending over that video. Our final talk comes from Julia Nieder-Römelin, a famous and renowned German philosopher. He teaches philosophy and political theory at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and was once the German Minister of State for Culture and the Media. He will talk about the more controversial aspects of the Corona debate in Germany.
Democracy is not only a form of government, democracy is also a form of life. So which form of life? Democracy constitutes a new collective identity, so to say. It's the republican, the democratic identity of citizens that try to find out what is good for us. What legislation is a good means for certain aims that we have. And certainly in any democracy there are lots of fights. That must be the case in order to get a clear view of the problems and what to do. But there must be a form of, let's say, higher order consensus. And this consensus is which are the adequate, the legitimate modes of discussion, of clarification, of decision-taking in a democracy. And there is also some cultural aspect involved. I call it civil culture. Civil culture means that we behave such that every person in this political community feels respected. So equal respect, equal recognition, equal liberty as authors of our lives is essential for democracy. So the logics of democracy is quite specific. And the logics of science is also specific. It's a different logic. The logic of science is about explaining certain empirical data, developing paradigms and theories that connect data that might be quite distant from each other at the first sight. For example, physical cosmology is an all-comprising theory, so to say. So large theories that explain what we can empirically see. In science and in politics, there are lots of dissensus. So persons dissent about this and that, about accounts, about theories, about forms of explanations in science, about the adequate measures that should be taken in order to reach a certain political goal. So deliberation is important for both of these realms, science and politics. If in a crisis, for example, in a pandemic crisis, we explain our political aims and political measures in the following way. We say, well, we talked with some virologists and they told us we should do this and that, and therefore we do this and that. Then something goes quite wrong. It is not possible on a merely scientific basis, and I am a scientist, philosopher who studied also physics and mathematics, so I'm close to science. Science is, so to say, my business, my work. But nevertheless, the idea that science itself decides what's politically right or wrong is not only misleading, it's quite dangerous in a democracy. Because in a democracy, the whole population, all those living in this form of life that constitutes democracy, are relevant. How we decide what is right and wrong, what is legitimate. So every political measure should be justified against every citizen in that state, if this state is a democracy. And this means that politics must be something else than a mere application of science. This is true for climate politics and for pandemic crisis, and it's true for the economic measures taken for growth, for example, or against inequality, and so on and so forth. One might also say politics is about norms, is a normative undertaking. We try to find out what is good, is a normative question. Whereas in science, we try to find out what is the case. This is not normative. So I think one of the challenges within this pandemic crisis is that we have a good, or I may say better, relation between science and politics. Politicians have to be enough courageous to say, well, we decided with these reasons for that measure, and we used scientific insights to explain why we find this measure the adequate one. But then they decide as politicians and not as mere applicating some scientific insight. And one side aspect of this pandemic crisis is that even if we have 80% or even more that think everything decided on is based on insights and is rational and acceptable and legitimate, if only 20% of the population gets the impression they are out of it, they are not part of deliberation, nobody talks with them, they are taken as being idiots, then we get a problem. This is not democracy. Democracy is always inclusive. And on all sides, we have to work on that. Inclusive, deliberative democracy.
Thank you very much, Julia Nieder-Rümelin, for those very important thoughts on the difficulty of political decisions today during the pandemic. We will now have a very interesting panel on how Europe's future should look like. Ivan Krastev, a prominent political scientist from Bulgaria, will discuss with Witold Waszczykowski, the former Polish foreign minister, about what direction Europe should take and whether there are common values that we all share or that we should at least all agree on. I will now hand over to Simone Brunner, who will moderate the discussion.
Hello, I would like to welcome you to the panel. What kind of Europe do we want? We, as mentioned, we will discuss this question today with two guests, Ivan Krastev and Witold Waszczykowski. Just a couple of words about Ivan Krastev. He is a political scientist, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, permanent fellow at the IWM, Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. And the second guest, Witold Waszczykowski, is a Polish politician, Right now, he is a member of the European Parliament of Polish Law and Justice Party, Peace Party, and he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2015 and 2018. So the question, what kind of Europe do we want? I think this is a question which is always very timely, but maybe especially during these days, because this week there was the European Summit in Brussels. Poland and Hungary were threatening to block the European Union budget because of a clause that would make some European Union funds conditional on certain rule of law criteria. There was a compromise in the end. I do not want to go into the details, but maybe it just this week has shown that we are constantly in European Union in this tension between different interests, different visions, different values. So I would like to start with Ivan Krastyev. In his books, he was focusing on crisis also of the European project. In his essay After Europe, and also in his book The Light That Failed, he was describing that the idea of the European project is somehow in crisis, like the liberalism. So he was analyzing this in his books. And Ivan, but maybe if you look to the future, maybe you see also a potential maybe for a new European vision. Maybe something we can all agree on.
No, listen, I started with the fact that for me it was critically important that European Union cannot be taken for granted. Probably this comes very much from the East European perspective, but everything which is political is fragile. And secondly, what is important is we're talking about common values, but values are contested everywhere. They're contested not only in Europe, they're contested on the level of the nation states. If you're going to look at the opinion polls, you're going to see that the major dividing line in Europe, for example, is not between the East and West, it is between the urban centers and the rural areas all over Europe. So from this point of view, I do believe that contestation is the normal state of politics. So crisis is not something that basically should paralyze our imagination. And also, interestingly enough, I do believe that the COVID-19 pandemic was a way to see also the promise of Europe in a different way. On one level, basically, when the epidemic started, the major message was stay home. And staying home was that people should decide where home is. But secondly, on the second day, we discovered how much we are dependent on places which are not our home, how difficult it is to live in a Europe with closed borders, how much we are missing this type of a Europe that normally we criticize. So I can agree with you that for sure, European kind of a future is going to be renegotiated all the time. So from this point of view, I don't believe that Europe is simply a project which has the beginning and which has an end. This is a constant contestations in which different people from different political positions are going to redefine what for them is the meaning of the European project at this very moment.
So thank you. So it was some kind of optimism during these difficult times.
Listen, of course it was an optimism, but you should not expect too much optimism coming from the Bulgarians. There was a famous opinion polls which economists summarized like this: the optimists, the pessimists, and the Bulgarians. We appear that we are much more pessimistic than our GDP per capita is going to suggest.
Okay, but I would like to ask Witold Waszczykowski. So do you agree? So maybe this collective experience now of the pandemic has kind of brought us closer together?
Well, we are together, of course, because the most important value for Europe, contemporary Europe, is the same as it was 70 or 80 years ago. It is peace and security. Especially for people coming from my part of Europe, especially for people from Poland, a country which used to be so negatively experienced in the history. So Europe was created some years ago, European Union was created some years ago, integration started for obvious reason, to avoid another war in Europe. And it happened. So I think that still we have this target in mind, this goal in mind. The problem is that we differ how to implement this. We think, for instance, the best way to implement the peace and to secure peace is through prosperity, is to help countries to develop itself, to develop wealth and prosperity. And for this reason, European institutions supposed to help us, countries, to develop itself, not to other way around, that countries are subordinated to European institutions, which are driven by some ideological ideas. No, if we think that the European Union is the institution to help us, citizens of Europe and nations of Europe and countries of Europe to develop prosperity, then to secure peace by cooperation with NATO and cooperation with the United States. So this is the way we can avoid the next war in Europe or next problems in Europe we used to experience, for instance, in 20th century.
So, but it means only more on economical terms and security terms, not political terms, not a political union?
No, I think that the problem started when some people in Europe started to think about a political Europe, about federalization, because it means that this can lead to hegemony. The problem is that maybe my colleague from Bulgaria, we together think about some kind of a central authority in Europe. Would be nice to have a kind of a Star Trek federation in Europe. The problem is that it's very difficult to find the democratic criteria, how to elect, how to select, how to choose in democratic way this kind of central authority. So let's keep the union as an institution which is helping the countries, the states, but don't think about the creation of some kind of a political center of gravity, because we will quarrel, we will fight each other against about this situation.
So, Ivan Krasiev, what are your thoughts about this? So, a European Union without a center? I mean,
it is even not so much about European Union without the center, but all this, for example, redistribution of money or everything that we are connected to is the European Union comes on the assumptions that there is some kind of a bigger political and economic space we are part of, which means that being Bulgarian citizens, I should have the equal rights being in Berlin and working in Poland and doing this and that, and the same for the investors. And I do believe this comes the strength from the single market. What I cannot imagine is how the single market is going to function if European Union is perceived simply as a coalition of states, because why then, for example, Germany should put money outside of its borders? Why Germany should not basically simply concentrate to supporting German companies? Why?
Because it's earning the money, because Germany is earning enormous money on the single market. That's the idea. This is the main beneficial country. The main beneficial comes from the single market.
No, I agree. But imagine, imagine in the moment of crisis, now everybody needs money. And you have two oppositions. There are some countries that have more money than others. And it's, to be honest, here, even Eastern Europe is not the biggest story, but of course, Italy, Spain. If Germany is going to invest very much in their own companies, obviously, they're going to do better on the single market than trying to redistribute to others. And I do believe this redistribution comes from the idea that, of course, we're not a federation. And from this point of view, we don't have a disagreement on this. But there is a common legal space in which being a company or being a citizen, I feel with equal rights in any part of Europe. And in my view, this is what makes the European project, for example, different than other type of an important project like NATO, which is just about security. NATO is very important. We're just staying together to defend each other in the moment of war. But European Union is slightly more than this, because you have a lot of Bulgarians, Poles, others, which are living outside of the territory of their countries. And they should feel kind of equally protected and equally free. And in my view, this is what makes the European project much more interesting. And this is why we cannot reduce it simply to a collection of sovereign states.
And maybe let's also try to think also in a different dimension, also on a topic that was also very, very polarizing recently within the European Union, the question So is there any, maybe Witold Waszczykowski, maybe you want to start. So is there anything imaginable if we go beyond just this concept of being only a club of economies? Is it thinkable any kind of common integration policy that is thinkable for European Union?
But why we have to create a common integration policy? Each country is different, and the needs of each country are different. So that's the first. The second, the problem is that migration covers two phenomena: political migration, we call them political refugees, and economic migrants. In case of political refugees, people who were persecuted because of a political activity, of course, we are open on the individual basis, of course, because each case is different. And each person who was politically persecuted can report at our border and apply for political asylum. And on individual basis, our country will grant or reject such a plea for political asylum. We cannot accept that for the political refugees, we're supposed to create a common policy and divide them by quotas by 1,000. No, if we start discussing about a phenomenon in thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of them, that's a problem which is covered by economic determinants and by security issue, which is of course purely state prerogative. So economic migration is driven by the job market on each country of the European Union and by the demography. If the demography requires and if job market allows us, we can open the borders, like we open the borders for millions of Ukrainians and Belarusians. But I don't understand why we're supposed to create a common policy for the million of economic migrants from Asia or from Africa.
Yeah, but this was a question that was, of course, but we are in a European Union, so. But maybe Mr. Krastiev, maybe do you think also what Mr. Waszczykowski touched, that maybe Poland is not getting enough credit for the fact that there are many Ukrainians and Belarusians who are working or having taken refuge in Poland?
No, I do believe that there's three different levels. And first, I agree very much with the minister that Poland is not the type of a closed country that you try to imagine. In a certain way, paradoxically, in the last 3 years, Poland is the European Union member states that has welcomed the highest number of economic migrants. And this is mainly around 2 million Ukrainians. Also paradoxically around more than 10,000 Pakistanis. I don't know why and how they came, but this is at least the statistics that I saw. Secondly, I'm in agreement that basically the idea of the quotas in the way it came in the midst of the refugee crisis is not the way the policies are going to work. It's in a certain way. What was strange, of course, was very much the reaction and the argument with which it was attacked, but we're talking about something different. Listen, at the moment when, for example, Germany decided to get economic migrants and decided to give them a citizenship, these people can travel and they can work in any of the EU member states. So from this point of view, the idea that you can simply close your country is also not going to work easily. In my view, the much more important question is European Union is going to face a choice, and here demography is a huge problem. And by the way, there was a major difference in the way demography is experienced in the East and the West, because don't forget, for the Western Europe, the problem of migration is mainly the problem of immigrants. For Central and Eastern Europe, it's also very much the problem of immigrants. How many of our own has left the country for the last 20 and 30 years? And for many countries, this is big numbers. More than almost 15% of the Bulgarian population has left for the last 30 years. In countries like for example, Baltic republics, the percent is even higher. So from this point of view, if you're going to have a common market, people are going to move. And from this point of view, this is the difference between people and trees. trees has roots, but people has legs. And you're not going basically to stop people from moving. So I do believe it is critically important not to decide what kind of a quota one country or the other is going to have, but basically how we are going to regulate the market in which the borders are open and you're going to be open to people coming from the other EU member states and trying to work in your country.
So maybe Mr. Waszczykowski, you want to comment somehow on this argument that some countries are countries of immigration, and especially Eastern European countries are countries of emigration, and that this creates this special momentum also when it comes to refugee policy.
Well, in case of Poland, we are both kind of a country because, of course, after joining the European Union, we exported about 1.5 million people to Western countries. It's about 1 million Poles living in the United Kingdom, and the Polish language, the second language on the islands. Of course, that was the benefit of the single market and open market by other European member countries for the job, opening the job market. But on the other side, because we were a closed country during the communist time, so we decided to keep our borders open after the collapse of the communists, and we are open for the migrants from other countries. Yes, we have number of Ukrainians, number of Belarusians. Yes, we do have quite large number of Vietnamese people, about 50,000, maybe more. We have several thousand people from other countries like Bangladesh, like Pakistan. They are also working on our job market. So we are open. The problem is, of course, which was not mentioned in my expression and Mr. Krastev, that there are problems about the Muslims who do not want to, who would like to immigrate to Europe, especially to western part of Europe, but they don't want to integrate and don't want to assimilate and live together with us. The large number of Muslim immigration is imposing rules on the host country, and this is the problem. Sometimes creates security issues. So, basing on this experience, negative experience of the Western countries like France, like UK, like Sweden, other Scandinavian countries, this is, I have to frankly admit that we are very much afraid of the large-scale Muslim immigration to Europe.
So unfortunately, our time is already over. So thank you very much for this short discussion. But I think those are questions that will be with us for a longer time. We will have an ongoing discussion on this, I think. Thank you, Ivan Krastev, and thank you, Witold Waszczykowski. So now I would like to announce the next part of our program, which will be a more artistic contribution by the artist Anna Saale. She's a writer and a designer of jewelry and fashion, and she will present her work, Rituals of Love. The video was recorded before, and interestingly, it was recorded in the Opera Village Africa, created by the German theater director Christoph Schlingensief, where she is currently on Artist in Residency program. Thank you.
So we are migrating to art.
Exactly.
Thank you.
In the face of this year's brutality, how many ways of kindness have you chosen to explore? How many words of love ran through your mind this morning when you looked at yourself in the mirror? How many of your decisions are driven by love? How many driven by fear? Did they cultivate the experience of togetherness and love, or that of division and anger? What an honor to be here with you, sharing time offered in the cultivation of unity, breathing together while we are allowed to. In freedom to make each other a part of what we know of magic or love. A ritual to survive the capricious chaos that we are surrounded by. A ritual to remind us to remain soft, to withstand the mounting harshness of fear and uncertainty, and To not only believe in ourselves, but to believe that this world is worth our sacrifices too. To be brave in love, even while the winter cold finds its way into our bones. The vulnerability of our existence overshadowing hope by how loneliness digs deeper into the material of our days. Air heavy like a constant weight to lift with every step made. Our pain romanticized to an extent that we feel discomfort in our healing. We turn the music louder and play hide and seek with our realities. We make jokes about our mental health. It's become so hard to tell the difference between a mindless statement and an actual cry for help. A ritual to be brave in love. Because, in the words of Bell Hooks, love is the only force that allows us to hold one another beyond the grave. That is why knowing how to love each other is also a way of knowing how to die. A ritual to bring a love ethic to every dimension of our lives and so force our societies to embrace change. Because love has not been a habit nor a ritual, more a word deprived of truth, a concept of control, a noun without a soul. In the face of this year's brutality, have you thought of the brutality of a year? The brutality of each year for the suffering? I hear that those suffering chose to suffer. I guess the way we chose rain on a Monday or a pandemic to bring the world to a standstill. Accountability, a foreign concept to our minds absorbed by privilege. Left to die at our borders, too. In the face of this year's brutality, do you see the rebellion and a hope rooted in rituals of love?
Thank you very much, Anya Saleh, for that wonderful performance, which I think in a way can also be read as an objection to some of the things said in the panel just beforehand. Anya Saleh is a writer and a poet, as well as a designer and educator. She was born and raised in the south of Germany and often moves back and forth between Germany and her ancestral home, which is Egypt. Since November 2020, she is an artist in residence in the Operndorf, Africa in Burkina Faso. Next, we want to address the big question, the big challenge that all of Europe is facing at the moment, and that is overcoming the corona crisis. We have an interview with Devi Shrida, Professor for Global Public Health at the University of Edinburgh. Devi was born in the US in 1984. She studied in Oxford in the UK and completed a Doctor of Philosophy degree in 2006. She will talk to my Zeit Online colleague, Jakob Zimak.
Hello. Thank you so much for having us, Sebastian and Hannah. And hi, Debbie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Let's start straight away. Europe is knee-deep in the second wave of the coronavirus pandemic. And in some places like Germany, it's actually worse than the first wave. If you had to sum up in a nutshell, very briefly, how do you view the pandemic response of Europe as a whole?
Well, I think the response was based on the flu model, which assumed a certain level of spread through the population and in a way underestimated this virus and the hospitalization rate, which is why we found ourselves in lockdown release cycles. And I think in the summer, there was a chance to really get the numbers low and try to hold them there. But instead, Europe opened up quite quickly. And so in a way now, Europe is paying for its summer holidays with winter lockdowns, which you could have probably seen in the summer, knowing what we know about this virus.
Mm-hmm. That's quite an emotive wording, but do you see a failure in Europe if you look at the pandemic response?
Well, it's hard to say failure because this is a really hard virus to manage. No country is finding it easy, and there are trade-offs for every country. So South Korea has traded off your right to privacy because of their tracing systems and how fast they can move. Hong Kong and Singapore, you've traded off your right to, let's say, movement, because if you're isolating, you're required to, or even have, a band on your ankle. New Zealand and Australia have traded off the right to international movement. They can't leave their country. They're stuck there. And at a certain point in Australia, you had to stay within your state. You couldn't move. And I think in Europe, we kind of want it all, right? So we want to have the ability to move across countries, keep borders open, have our economies open, have our health services running. And so I think what we're seeing is a failure to prioritize what do you want during this pandemic, and to make those choices and trade-offs clear to the public. Instead, we're kind of seeing a reactive strategy where we're kind of forced into decisions that perhaps if we had more time, we would have taken a different one.
Mm-hmm. You advocated very early on in Scotland for a strategy to really bring down transmission to almost zero. And that's the so-called suppressant strategy. That's what you advocated for. But looking at Scotland right now, we have a cumulative, basically 100,000 cases. We have 40,000 deaths in 2020. What went wrong in Scotland?
So in Scotland at the start, Scotland's part of the UK, so it's 4 nations, and we all went into lockdown, the 4 nations at the same time, which was really late. So we went into lockdown March, I think 22nd or 23rd, where, and earlier around March 12th, they knew testing and tracing had broken down and they still didn't, get the lockdown in place. So one, it was a late lockdown, which cost lots of lives. And then I think in the summer in general, we did get numbers low. So if you look at the genetic sequencing, you can see the first strains were eliminated in the summer. But then I think we opened up to tourism, we opened up to travel. We had people go abroad on holidays and come back. We had universities open with very few checks on students coming in. And it just kicked off a second wave of this new strain. And so we're back, I guess, to dealing with this virus. And so I think, the lesson for me from this has been around border measures and screening and reimportation. Public health as a whole has always said, keep everything open. The international health regulations advise against travel and trade restrictions. But the countries that have done the best in terms of suppression have put in place very strict 14-day quarantines. So I think that's one thing that's a huge lesson for Scotland in the future, but we have limited ability to do it because Scotland's not its own country. So we have to rely on down south, number 10, and the Prime Minister leading the way on that. So it's kind of a difficult, because we kind of have responsibility, but not the full ability to be able to do what we want to do.
That leads to my next question quite well, actually. That's the question of, you already touched on some countries that traded off different things for having very low transmission. What do these very different countries have in common? I mean, looking at Uruguay, looking at New Zealand, looking at Taiwan, looking at China, very different countries. What do they have in common that they managed to control the pandemic so well?
So yeah, we did a Lancet article on this, analyzing countries that have done better, and it's 3 things. So the first is really good guidance to their populations on avoiding the virus at all ages. So avoid crowded spaces, avoid indoor settings, wear face coverings, and taking it seriously. I think in Europe, there's been a complacency around the spread in younger groups, saying, oh, well, younger people are generally asymptomatic or mild, where you don't really want anyone getting this virus. The second thing they did was very good test, trace, and isolate. I think Europe got the testing and tracing going, but isolation has been a problem of actually making sure people comply with that 14 days of managed isolation. And the third thing is border measures, so you don't re-import. So there's no point clearing the virus if it keeps coming in and setting off new chains. Then your testing and tracing breaks down. As soon as your numbers get high enough, you can't test and trace and isolate enough people, so you're forced into a lockdown. So I think it's those 3 things really that they've done. And I think in Europe, the third one is a really hard ask. The freedom of movement, the idea of Europe is about openness. And so it goes kind of against that idea of staying open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to ask you something about that as well, because you spoke about trade-offs. And I mean, looking at China, for example, that locked down metropolitan areas entirely, looking at South Korea with a really apparent neglect of privacy, combining CCTV data, credit card data, mobile data, basically, to really find these chains of transmission. Do you think these suppression strategies in general can be reconciled with like European ideas of movement, of liberty, of freedom at all? Is there a chance for that? I mean, looking at the world, there's quite a big question mark there, I guess.
Of course, I think that was always there. But on the flip side, what we've seen in Europe is populations going into lockdown, which are more draconian than anything that East Asia has had. I mean, if you look at East Asian countries, their lockdowns have been much lighter, or their restrictions have been much less in terms of putting people in their homes than what we've had in Spain, in the UK, where the message has been stay at home. So in a way, I think the surprising thing is how much compliance we saw with the first lockdown and how willing people are to lock down again, or even the uptake of face coverings, how many people are willing to wear face coverings when at the start, people were like, oh, I'm not going to wear that. Now they're pretty universal in indoor spaces, at least here in the UK and in public transport. So I think it is surprising that in the face of an infectious disease, how our ideas of what is acceptable and not acceptable suddenly change in the context of a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. And also the question of where you get your liberty if you have strict measures at the very beginning of things, I guess. Let's touch one last topic, and that's risk groups, basically. Looking at the German data, we have 87% of death in the groups older than 70. And looking at the UK, that's been very notorious for its care homes who had large outbreaks. Didn't we invest enough and didn't we try hard enough to really shield these people from infections, these very vulnerable populations?
I mean, I think there were efforts, but the truth is it's really hard. What we see in, let's say, the UK is your care home outbreaks are linked to your community prevalence. And the people working in care homes, the people working in hospitals are going back to their communities. And testing can only take you so far because you can test negative one day and be positive the next. So test isn't perfect in terms of completely shielding risk groups. So I think, yes, obviously you have to prioritize, but I think there are ethical issues with completely saying, let the virus run through the young and just shield the vulnerable. And I think what's most worrying to me about this virus is the long COVID aspect of young people who get chronically ill, almost like an autoimmune condition where they're sick for months. So I think, yes, we need to be shielding those most at risk of death, but we also need to be figuring out why do people get severely ill from this or chronically ill from this virus in younger age groups, because that's going to take a bigger toll on your economy and on your society.
Mm-hmm. But let me ask again, you say we got to shield them. I mean, in a lot of places testing and I mean, even rapid antigen testing was not in place in this fall, and we knew there would be some sort of second wave. And there were no FFP2 masks, which can also help not transmitting the virus. I mean, there is certainly an amount of not acting enough on that, is there?
Well, definitely. I mean, I think the biggest mistakes in Europe, and you saw it in February and March already, was the scramble for enough PPE. I didn't think they anticipated that they would need that to protect healthcare workers, the scramble for reagents, for enough testing and PCR testing, and then towards antigen tests, now getting them up and going in enough doses. So I think, but I think with Europe now, what we're going to see is a turn now towards vaccines and trying to get out of this through vaccines. And luckily we have a few vaccines which are effective, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca. So I think in some way the scramble is now going to become around vaccines and getting that through. And that's going to be like the new way of trying to get enough doses and getting them out in time.
Okay, thank you so much, Debbie. I think we've touched some very crucial points. Shortly though, pandemic response, looking at Europe, looking at other countries in the world with suppression strategy. We talked about liberties, we talked about risk groups, and I hope this will help you later on in your heads-on discussions. And for now, I give back to the studio to Hannah and Sebastian. Thank you again, Debbie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie and Jakob. This is actually the second time that we have the joy to produce Europe Talks with partners from all over the continent. And Philipp Feigler, who's one of our co-founders, will now talk to former participants of Europe Talks 2019. They will talk about what they felt, how they met, and whether they were able to find some similarities despite all their differences.
Thanks, Hannah. Hello, I'm Philip. I'm one of the co-founders of My Country Talks, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Joanna Popiewek and Christoph Gernhardt. Joanna works at the University of Danzig in Poland, and during Europe Talks last year, she stood up very, very early at 3 a.m. in the morning and traveled more than 1,000 kilometers just to meet Christoph and have an argument with him. And Christoph is a customer manager from Germany. Today, he's working for a medical startup in Berlin. And when Joanna started her journey last year, the two of them had never met before. All they knew was that they were totally at odds about topics like the relationship to Russia or migration. So when they finally met in Brussels last year, they argued for more than one day. And we are very excited to have them here now to talk about their experiences with Europe Talks. Welcome, Joanna. Welcome, Christoph. So, Joanna, a journey of 1,000 kilometers, waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning. Honest answer, was it worth it?
For sure, I've never been in Brussels and I'm always curious to meet new people. So yeah, definitely yes.
So you both disagreed on 6 questions last year, for example, about climate change, the role of Russia. So what was the most controversial topic during that very, very long conversation? I mean, almost one day, Christoph.
Good question. I think probably it was Russia in the end. While I would say also we really had a discussion which was like, exchanging points of view rather than like giving just the own point of view. But I do think we talked a lot about Russia and about the role of Europe and how Poland and Germany are part of Europe and what should be our relations with Russia. Should we have a European stand? Is that possible at the moment? I think that were like the biggest topic, maybe. I don't know, Johanna, how was it for you? Was it Russia as well? Or?
Maybe you didn't understand. The question was, what was the most controversial topic for you?
For me, the kind of interesting topic was the one connected with the European identity. It was about European passports also. We discussed it during the interview quite long time, as far as I remember this. Simply, I feel like European citizen, but I don't want to give up national identity in place of European. I mean,
and Christoph disagreed last year.
Yeah, as far as I understand, it was one of these points.
Yeah, I think, we disagreed, but we also agreed to disagree. Because I think we could understand where the point of view is coming from. So I do understand that Poland at the moment probably just really wants to be also own country at the moment, doesn't want to give up right now the status of being a complete country and their own citizen of Poland. And probably that takes much longer actually for Europe to grow together, to have, generation. We're all Europeans and we want a European passport. So I think in the end, I don't know, Johanna, how it was for you, but it was like we exchanged ideas and it was never really like somebody got really stuck on one point. So saying like, oh, no, that's impossible. It was like, okay, maybe not now, maybe not at this moment, but it really led to like exchanging points of views, which I really did like. I did like it a lot. And we actually continued talking a lot over the day, even after the interview.
You spent the whole day together, right?
Yeah, we've been sitting in the cafe for a few hours on the street, and then we keep talking, buying new tea, coffee, and we're sitting. That was really, really cool. And then we went far from the topics. We were talking about different things, and it was really, really crazy and cool day.
Was there something that surprised you, something that you were surprised by?
Me?
Well, we briefly interrupt this conversation with Philip and the two former participants because there seem to be some audio problems, which I think we're all used to after several months of this pandemic and Zoom calls. We quickly go to a video that was sent to us by the famous artist Olafur Eliasson, and he recorded it in his studio in Berlin, the Studio Olafur Eliasson, which he founded in 1995. Olafur has realized numerous major exhibitions, won countless awards, and we're really happy to have this contribution for Europe Talks as part of the program.
My name is Olafur Eliasson, and I am sending you this message containing a few considerations on Europe from my studio here in Berlin. And I'm very excited. Thank you for having me, and I will not take too much of your time. I'm recording it as a selfie. Trying to speed up. It's working, I think. Look at this. And here you can actually see. There's the selfie. So listen, Europe and all of that. I was recording just before a conversation between a dog and a tree. Not very easy, but in the context of Earth Speaker, an app I did, I'll talk about it in a second, it actually works. And of course, the dog and the tree were wondering whether the Human Rights Charter was as good as we think it is. And I think it is, but it so happens that we forgot when we did the Human Rights Charter, we did forget, that's now 75 years ago roughly, we did forget all the plants and species. Imagine if we had gotten them along back then, maybe Europe and the rest of the world might be different now. So I'm sort of preparing for suggesting the rights of personhood, as one calls it, being a part of the close by future for environmental reasons. See, now what I wanted to suggest is that it's so, as I see it, it so happens that Europe is in fact doing quite well in many ways. I think that it's not just about human rights. It so happens that education, health, economy, social welfare, a lot of European countries are, as I mentioned, overall, Europe is pretty amazing. Of course, it's pretty complex, and I'm not talking about competition, or I'm not talking about ousting and shaming and all of that. I just want to say there are also good things to say. And we sometimes forget that. We just, I was like with all the EU foreign ministers recently, and it was like as if they didn't like Europe. You know, it was like I know they are there to somehow solve the problem. So they talk about problems all the time. But then they talk to the press, and then the press only talk about problems. And of course, we end up thinking that Europe is actually a complete mess. And it's not. It's like actually pretty bloody amazing. And this is, I think, one of the great things that I thought I should mention to you. That is, there's lots of challenges. There are lots of things that can be better. It so happens there's a selfie stick standing here. Isn't that nice? Okay, here we go. Here. You won't be seasick now. It so happens there's lots of stuff that is actually working out pretty well. There are places that are struggling and where there's injustice. When I say justice, think of the fact that we have, when I make art, we have this idea, there's something which is truth, right? Truth is something you can prove. Most legislative laws are built upon that one is guilty of something if you can prove it, right? Then we have something called belief. I believe in this or that. Whether faith or just like I believe in my friend. Belief you don't need to prove. Now you have this space in between. You sometimes hear people say, I can hear you speak the truth, but I can't believe you. And I think we should somehow explore that a little bit, if you don't mind me coming with a recommendation. There's a great philosopher from Martinique, I believe, called Glissant. And let me just say a small quote, which happens to lay on this table right here. Edward Glissant. I can change through exchange with other without losing or diluting my sense of self. That's pretty brilliant, right? This notion of, being together without having to be the same or without having to agree. You can still work it out. It seems that a polarization, which is sort of on the move around the world, but also in Europe, sort of the polarized idea of the self always defines itself on the opposition. Maybe we can be together and be different, right? That's a potential there, because for me it has to do with a European public space. It has to do with the idea that we have more in common than what sets us apart. And the public space, which I as an artist work in very often, is so valuable. We always think, private space, private sector, that's valuable because you can buy and sell it. But what is really valuable is public space, the things we all own together. And it represents our values. Don't forget that if we talk about love and care and, humanity, justice is an institutionalized version of love, or of sort of love in the broader sense, right? This brings me a little closer to the end, as my time is clearly just is going much faster than I thought. There's someone who is so inspiring to me called Sarah Schulman. That's my other quote. That's the end of my quotes. But Sarah Schulman, she's a playwright, she's an author and a queer activist. She's brilliant. And what she says, we need to cultivate zones of conflict, even though they are uncomfortable, we should not shy away for disagreement. So you can see it works with the Glisson. There is a room for disagreeing or conflict, which does not immediately become about abuse. The public space I'm talking about is not a European overcooked piece of pasta. It's not like some fluffy, undefinable thing. It's like an amazing representation of everything we believe in. This is so important. And of course, there are ways to deal with that artistically. One of which is the app, work of art I did as an app for young people. The young people in Europe. It's in 25 languages, and I made it on behalf of the German presidency in the European Union this year. It's an app which actually listens, and it's about listening. That's Sarah Schulman also. She talks about the need for radical listening. Listening to young people and children. So it's actually not for grown-ups like you, but nevertheless, you're the listeners, right? It's about showing that we don't need to give young people a voice. They have one. We just need to actually acknowledge it and listen to it. And there's something for me that is profoundly European in that. Everyone in Europe thinks that they have something important to say. Oh, there's this wrong with Europe, this is wrong with Europe, this is wrong with Europe. I think, and this is then, my modest conclusion here, maybe what we could exercise is this idea of radical listening. Also listening to, like really listening to the ones we disagree with, to the ones who represent a conflict, the other, right? And this is, I think this is just so interesting as to, what about tomorrow? What about this facing forward? You do know that in Berlin, after the wall came down, I'll find out who said that. I'm not facing east, I'm not facing west. It's very European. I'm facing forward, right? I like that a lot. I'm not saying everything's about the progress and sort of more and more and more, but in the most humble, being a European way, I do think there is a moment of re-evaluating what it is we're doing and how it is we're doing, and most importantly, why it is we're doing. And out of this, I think a common, great democratic society will flourish. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Olafur Eliasson, for those very inspiring thoughts and actually the very nice insight into your studio in Berlin. And I think that we now have a new connection back to Philip, Joanna, and Christoph. Do you hear me, Philip?
Yes, thanks, Hannah. Sorry for the interruption and sorry for some audio problems. I hope we can continue the discussion now. Christoph, I was asking you about your discussion, and I was asking you what the most controversial topic during your last very long conversation was, and then I think we had some audio problems. Maybe you can repeat that answer.
Yes, I hope one can hear me now. So as Johanna pointed out, like the most controversial was actually, one of them was if we want to have a European passport. That's also one of the answers we actually disagreed on beforehand. And it was very interesting for us because I'm pro European passport, but I also think it will take time. And for Johanna, it was like, no, it's not the right time yet at all, I guess. But the interesting point for us was that we didn't like just stand on our opinions. We actually exchanged the thoughts about it. So, yes, I think it needs time. I also have an understanding that Poland is maybe, or not everybody in Poland is ready yet to give up a passport for Poland itself. I think in Europe it's quite discussed. But yeah, for me, that's something I would definitely look into in the future. And I would be very proud if one day we have the chance to actually have European passports.
So, Joanna, was there something that surprised you? I mean, like you talked for one day. Was there anything that surprised you during that conversation?
Well, to be honest, the most important for me, it was that I could share my opinions openly, because Christoph was a complete stranger for me. And when I'm speaking about controversial things at home, I need to really lower down my level of opinion, because if I say something wrong, for example, which my boss do not agree, it can be, not so nice for me in the future. So, talking with the stranger about controversial topics, you can be open, you can be really you. And that's why this event is so cool, so interesting.
Now, there are a lot of participants in the audience who will have a discussion in a few minutes. Do you have any advice for them for their discussion? Christoph.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Joanna just said. I think it's very important to use this as a forum where you can openly share and try to understand the other person. It's not about winning an argument or anything. It's actually, it's a great opportunity to really exchange thoughts and have different opinions on different topics. So it's really, really good to have the chance to have the setup to meet other people from different countries in Europe. So it's a great potential, actually. And different opinions are important. Like, we're a big family. We're a European family with lots of different ideas, lots of different backgrounds. The world changed the last 10, 20, 30 years a lot. And all of us have been through some extent through those changes. So it's super important to be open and to listen to each other and also try to understand the other view, and maybe one even finds agreement in the end. Because we ended up talking like 1.5 days. We even took a city trip the next day, walked all through Brussels and had sightseeing.
Yeah. And Joanna, very short answer. Do you have any advice for our participants?
Well, guys, do not afraid to talk with each other, because come on, they will not kill you because you have different opinion. Come on, you know, my answers and Christoph's were sometimes more yes, more no, but we had to choose. And then we discussed this. We were sitting during the walk over the Brussels. We talk all the time. And that was so refreshing.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, Christoph. It was a pleasure talking to you. And I hope we will see each other soon. Joanna,
Thank you.
Hannah, Sebastian, back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can tell, we're moving closer to today's highlight, which is thousands of conversations taking place all across Europe, and actually also for those of you who are listening to this on Hop-In, for you on our Hop-In platform. Our next and last part of the program is actually a very important one. When we first came up with the idea for first Germany Talks, which later became Europe Talks, it was just an experiment. It was kind of a crazy idea. I mean, we wanted to introduce complete strangers to one another. They'd never met, and they were supposed to talk about politics, and we weren't sure whether that's going to work. Amazingly, it did. And only later did we find out there's actually a whole body of research that deals with this topic. What happens when you meet someone for conversations like that? How can that help to overcome conflict? How can you reach an agreement? How are you supposed to go about this conversation? And one of the leading experts in this field, who Philip Feigle, who you just saw as a moderator, actually went to interview, is Peter Coleman. Peter Coleman works at the Difficult Conversation Labs at Columbia University, and he's seen probably thousands of conversations taking place in his lab, sort of as a scientific experiment. And he can tell us a lot about what participants should be looking out for today. And we now have him on our program today. And again, the moderator will look very familiar to you. It's again, Philip Feigle. Over to you.
Thanks, Sebastian, and welcome, Peter Coleman. Peter, as Sebastian said, Peter is a professor of psychology and education at the Columbia University. And in his Difficult Conversations lab, hundreds of people have argued about highly politicized topics like gun control or abortion. And interestingly, some of these conversations escalated and others were surprisingly constructive. And Peter and his team are studying these conversations and are interested in the question, what makes one type of conversation different from the other? And today I would like to talk with him about the question, how can we have better political conversations in everyday life or at Europe Talks? And how can dialogue succeed as a tool for reducing tension between opponents. Welcome, Peter. Peter, in a few moments, welcome. Peter, in a few moments, thousands of people, many of whom are watching us now, will find themselves in a situation that you have been studying in your laboratory in New York for many years. They will have a complicated argument with a stranger. So what is your first or maybe most important advice for these participants?
Well, pardon me. Let me begin by just expressing my appreciation for being here and to say to your audience that you know, congratulations. This is a fantastic gift you're giving the world, is the willingness to talk to others who differ from you on important issues. Right. So we've studied this, and for probably about 20 years now, there are a series of things we've learned that we can't cover in 15 minutes, but I'm gonna highlight 5 things, 5 ideas, 5 rules that you can use in thinking about how to enter these conversations. And I'll start by saying that, you know, one of the things we've learned from the study of these is that beginnings matter a lot. How you initiate the conversation, how you come into the conversation, those first moments of how you feel, how the climate that you established, how you sort of frame your issues or concerns, all of that really can matter in determining the trajectory of the conversation. So, and this is in complexity science called sensitivity to initial conditions. And it is when things begin a certain way, they tend to follow that trajectory. And so given that, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that you ask yourself a simple question about change, which is that, do you believe that people can change? Do you believe that situations can change, that you can change, others change? Because one of the things we find from the study of really long-term intractable conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that people that hold the basic assumption that, you know, others don't really change, situations don't really change, if you harbor that belief, then we tend to approach these conversations either just in a contentious manner or in a sort of disengaged manner. But if you really understand that you, in fact, can and have changed, others can change, situations can change dramatically. If you understand that, then there's hope and there's reason to engage, and people tend to engage in a more earnest and constructive way. So that's the first question is, you know, do you believe? Yeah.
Maybe a bit practical question. When you say the beginning is so important,
yeah.
What is maybe a good start for a conversation? Can you give us an example? Is it a question, or what shall I do?
Well, again, you know, what matters most is that you come into that conversation with some kind of sense of your intention. Like, what do you hope to achieve in this situation? Because that will determine the best way to begin the conversation and ultimately the direction of the conversation. And I have to say that most of us in Western society are trained to move into, you know, debate. We're trained to go after the issue, you know, listen to the other side and to try to find flaws in their logic, and then to leverage those flaws in order to win the game of the argument, right? And that is you know, something that's pervasive in our legal systems and on television, and, you know, and I was trained to debate in high school, right? So many of us by default move into that. And what I want to say is that, you know, if that is your intention, if your intention is to have a spirited debate, that's fine, as long as you kind of adhere to the cooperative rules of debate, right? Which is respecting the other, you know, listening to their points of view. If they make good points, you know, accommodate them. But if your intention is not to move into a more competitive, even contentious dynamic, because you have issues that are really important to people and their identity is wrapped up in them, debate is a dangerous path because it tends to move us into a more contentious, escalated, even personalized kind of conversation. The alternative is what we call dialogue, which you referred to earlier. And dialogue, I think, is not well understood. dialogue is really the opposite of debate. It's a space where people can learn and discover things about themselves and about the issues and about the other's life and experience that they really didn't know of coming in. So oftentimes in processes of debate, of dialogue, I will learn things about my own position and my own confusion about my position that help me move forward. So if that is your goal, if it is to sort of learn, then ideally, you know, what you do is you kind of start by setting up some basic ground rules. And that is that, you state that you really are interested in hearing from them and understanding their position on this as much as possible. And so what that means is that you allow each other to move into stories where you tell your story, as personally and as honestly as possible.
You would recommend that, to tell your own story?
I would recommend that you begin by trying to reach some kind of an agreement about how you will have this conversation, because the how is critical. And one way to do that, as opposed to me countering every position that you offer and challenging you, is to suggest that you open it up initially by allowing each of you to talk as long as you wish, and as honestly as possible about why this issue is important to you, what it means to you, how did you come to your understanding of it. Someone once said that you want to allow people to talk long enough to come to begin to understand what they don't understand, right?
I see.
So, and that, again, if you can imagine, is a fundamentally different kind of conversation than the game of debate, which is me sort of countering your argument. That's more of a chess game. So it depends on what you want, right? If you're really engaging in this in order to show them that they're wrong and in order to prove that you're right and in order to win a game, then you would proceed as you would in debate by basically asking for their position and then countering it.
So how important is the setting of the discussion for the outcome and quality? I mean, like, is it better to have a one-on-one discussion in private? Because one of our readers is asking at the moment, for example, is it also possible to have a good debate on social media? Or is this not a good idea?
Well, it's more difficult on social media. Again, it depends on anonymity. If there is anonymity on social media, if you don't really know who the other people are, then there's, of course, the norms are just wide open. And so people are more inclined to be more extreme in their positions, use more contentious rhetoric. So that's the challenge with social media. It can be that on social media, you actually build relationships with people that you communicate with a lot. And that can be a constructive conversation if you're invested in that conversation. Those can change people. But generally speaking, because there are so few guidelines on most of the social media platforms, things can escalate much more easily. But it's a good question. I think the place matters. You want to think carefully about where you are. Can you hear each other? Are you both comfortable? And one of the things I would recommend that we've learned from our research that you consider is that as opposed to trying to talk it out, you walk it out. You actually invite the other person to take a walk with you outside if it's a nice day, to move together. What we found from research, neuroscience research, is that when people who have a dispute, who are in disagreement, get up and move together side by side, particularly outside, then they tend to sort of become in sync, physiologically in sync. Their mirror neurons start to connect to one another, and it elicits more of a cooperation, more empathy, more compassion for the other side. So if that's possible, it's a fairly useful way of beginning to connect to one another.
Very interesting. So generally speaking, is it a good thing to show emotions, or should I try to hide them during a discussion?
Well, it depends on the emotions, of course. If you feel yourself becoming enraged, I think it is important, again, because initial conditions matter so much, it is important to have some sense of where you are emotionally when you come into the conversation. And ideally that you, as much as possible, try to sense where the other person is. My guess is that most people will feel some level of anxiety coming into this conversation because There's some issue, it may be a moral issue on which they differ. And if your anxiety is high and their anxiety is high, then what our research shows is that we're more inclined to be more extreme in how we approach the conversation or the dispute. So again, putting yourself in a place where you're a little bit more at least aware of what your emotional state is, and ideally a little bit more relaxed, which can simply be deep breathing, and sort of centering yourself before the conversation. But as emotions come up, yes, I think that ideally you want to communicate them. And there are, of course, big cultural differences in this. In some cultures, if you don't express your emotions, you're withholding and you're being cold. In others, if you do, it's inappropriate. So knowing the norms of your community certainly help. But generally speaking, if you're aware of your emotional experience and can label it for the other person, that can, if you're able to share that in a way that invites them to share their emotional experience as well, that can also change the tenor of the conversation.
I have one more question from the audience. Someone is asking, how do you break down mental walls if someone really is defensive?
Yeah. So again, these things can take a lot of time. This is not something usually that you can attack, right? And that's why I discourage the use of debate, particularly if this is a one-off encounter with somebody that will be, a half hour, an hour sitting together. Oftentimes people change their mind because they start to trust each other. They build a sense of rapport from each other. And that starts to open them up to a different kind of conversation and to discovery and learning. And it is through discovery and learning that we change, right? We change our attitudes, we change our mind. So it's not, the one thing I will say in dialogue, and there's good research on this, is that if you tend to be a person who has some kind of higher status in the community, right? That can be gender status, racial status, ethnic status. If you happen to find yourself with that kind of differential, what we found is that it's particularly important for those of us that are kind of in high power, like white males, to listen earnestly, because that is the way to open up the other, right? Oftentimes people in positions of lower power need to express themselves and feel heard. And if they really genuinely feel heard, they're much more open to shifting their attitudes. But those of us that are in high power need to hear. We need to generally move into a place of dialogue and discovery. And those two things, hearing and be heard, are the transformational essence of dialogue.
So thanks, Peter. That was very, very interesting. Unfortunately, our time is nearly over. It was a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully your advices make it easier for some participants to start their conversation in a few minutes. So back to my colleagues in the studio, Sebastian and Hannah.
Thank you, Philip.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter and Philip, for those very unique insights into how to have a difficult conversation, which many of you are going to have within a few minutes. We have actually already come to the end of our event, but before you leave, I would like to thank all of our media partners, panelists, speakers, moderators, and supporters who have made this great event possible today. Many people have forgotten how to talk to each other. Political polarization is indeed one of the biggest challenges European democracies are facing today. And with Europe Talks, we really hope to make a contribution to get people back into dialogue with each other, to talk and to listen. Those of you who have already found the match, you can now leave and have your personal debate on whatever platform you and your partner chose. While you talk, please bear those questions in mind. So, as a small reminder, now the questions. Should protecting people from the coronavirus be the first priority, even if the economy suffers? Should masks be mandatory in all public spaces? Should schools always remain open throughout the pandemic? Should richer European countries help poor ones in the fight against corona? Should all European countries have to accept refugees? Is Russia a threat to Europe? And should all European cities be car-free?
Thank you, Hannah. So once again, if you already have a match and you both confirmed the meeting, we introduced you to one another via email and you should be in touch. And you probably agreed on a platform or a way of how to contact one another and start your conversation right now. You do not need Hopin for that. And we thank you very much for participating in our event today. And we wish you a lot of fun and a great experience with your conversation. For those of you on our Hopin platform, you signed up to Europe Talks as well, but unfortunately your discussion partner did not confirm the meeting, or for some reason you're here without a match today. Do not despair, because for the first time ever, we're able to introduce you to someone new right here on this platform. And I will tell you in a second just how that works. Something to bear in mind is that this matching is not going to be done by an algorithm. So there is a chance that you meet someone from the same country or you meet someone you actually agree with. We still think it's worth to have a good conversation over a cup of tea or over a cup of coffee. So stay on Hopin, and here is what you need to do. On the left-hand side, as you can see here, there's a button that says networking. The moment you click on that button, it will ask you to confirm that you want to be introduced to someone, and you're going to jump in straight into the conversation with that person. We really hope that's going to work out for you guys. You have, I think, at least 3 hours for your discussion, so plenty to talk about. We wish you, again, a lot of fun. Thank you, our viewers and listeners, our partners and supporters today for making this event possible. And with that, we wish you a great day, Merry Christmas, and all the best for the next year. Thank you very much.